Hello, my name's Etrian. Today we're going to be doing a tier list for the Ravager faction in Acolyte of the Altar. So for context, we'll be using tiers S, A, B, and C for today. The S tier is going to contain cards which are so strong that they're considered must-pick every time they're offered, or alternatively, they're a little bit more situational but they win the game on the spot once you've drafted them, more or less. Next we have the A tier. This is going to be cards that are very strong, both in context and out of context, standing on their own as cards. They're going to contribute meaningfully to good strategies for your run. Next we have the B tier. This might be cards which are strong, either in or out of context of a run, but they do require a little bit more support in order to be effective in every run, or they don't support the main strengths of the Ravager faction, or they're outclassed by better alternatives. And then lastly, we have the C tier, which is where I'm going to be placing any cards which I personally tend to avoid or reroll instead of picking. The final bit of context for the list is going to be a brief overview of the kind of strengths and weaknesses that Ravager as a faction has as a whole, because this is going to influence how good or bad different Ravager cards are going to be for the faction. So Ravager, I consider their most effective playstyle in a vacuum to be spending your early turns developing a board, right, of numerous minions, and that's going to be enabled by things such as Cannon Fodder, just a cheap aggressive minion, and all other minions like it, Beast Tormentor, Crumbling Gargoyle, etc. Also, we have cards like Cathedral Conservator, which will be providing you with an extra body on the board every single turn. You also have effects like Fearguard's Battle Trainer and also like Swarm Them, which will provide you with either a net positive of minions on your board for your investment, or it'll provide you with much, much stronger minions, which will be resilient to removal and therefore effectively establishing a bigger board for you. Then after your early turns are completed, you move into the mid to late game, which for this faction is going to be between turns 4, 5, and 6. Unlikely you're going to have many fights go on any longer than that. These are going to be cards like Baphomet the Cruel and also Leviathan, which reward you for having established this large board and provide you with a burst of damage, which will be finishing the game either on the turn you play them or shortly thereafter. So that's going to be what I consider to be the most effective strategy for Ravager, and that's what the majority of the cards that you're going to be offered are going to be supporting. Now, other options that you have, you can play a slower, more stally game plan with the intention of reaching higher turn counts, higher mana counts, and in extension you'll be able to play stronger cards. That's supported by cards such as Iron Maiden, has a large amount of health and it can survive hits, and then it does damage for doing so. It's supported by cards like Wave of Lava down here, which is almost enough damage to win a fight by itself eventually. These are the kind of things that would be supporting a playstyle like that. However, the problem is that Ravager by itself is not capable of playing the long game. You must have support from, in most cases, from empiricists, right? They're going to be giving you that early borrowed life that's going to enable you to survive those early turns without having to play those early minions, which are susceptible to overpower damage, which is a big problem that this faction has. Lastly, it has some pretty solid mid-range minions, right? Some good things in the 4 or 5 mana cost range. Spindle Hatch is an example there. Again, we mentioned earlier the Iron Maiden. We have a lot of good cards in this range of mana costs, so it's also possible to play a more mid-rangey game, so you can benefit both from those early game powerhouses and also from those late game powerhouses like Wave of Lava. But I find that Ravager excels most just completely focused on early game swarming into a mid game push for lethal. So, with all that out of the way, time to get into the tier list. Starting with Afflicted Nomad. This card, just by its very nature, right, is not going to qualify for our S or A tier. simply because it requires synergies to be effective. Right now it does have that 3 mana 3/4 body, which is valuable, especially the 4 health there, which is not a common thing for a Ravager to have access to, especially not on a 3 mana minion. That is a valuable asset to have, right? And so this is not an undesirable card, but in order to get value out of the +1/+1 from Infested or Ignited, obviously you're going to require sources of infestation or sources of ignition, which in and of themselves are not necessarily the most valuable things for Ravager to be getting its hands on. So for this reason, we've put Afflicted Nomad into the B tier. Next, we have Baphomet the Cruel. This card is S tier, of course. 3 mana for a 6/6, already very attractive. The text expands on that further by giving us access to charge and the rally keyword and +3 attack. So in other words, when you're playing this minion, right, this not usually going to be any earlier than turn 4, except in the very early fights. You'll attack for somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 or so damage with whatever board that you have established from the previous turns, and then you play Baphomet, and then you attack again, and it's going to be 9 damage from Baphomet plus whatever damage is left over from the minions that weren't dominated. The Dominate 3 keyword, obviously this enforces that strategy that Ravager has of going wide with smaller minions, smaller, cheaper minions, and then using them as a resource to pay for these Dominate effects. So Baphomet, excellent card, superb finisher, fits right into our strategy, and even if it didn't fit right in, it still has excellent numbers on the card. For this reason, it gets S tier. Oh yeah, also a notable thing about the Dominate keyword here, this means that for Ravager, the dog event is bittersweet, right? Having a free body on the board every combat, in addition to the free body we're already getting, Vent Crab, that's excellent for us. Getting the burn damage that the dog does is excellent for us, and the dog retreating to the back line can be very meaningful as well. It's good at eating parries, for example. You swing it in there, eat the parry, it goes to the back line, you don't have to worry about it getting finished off after that. But on the other hand, it is extremely susceptible to Dominate, and in my opinion is that it is not worth not playing Dominate cards just to prolong the life of your dog. So that is something to keep in mind as a weakness of this faction. Next we have Beast Tormentor. Obviously superb stat line for the cost. We're paying 1 mana for 4/3 stats, which is something we'd be willing to pay 3 mana for. So we're way ahead of the curve on that one. The play effect advancing all rage gauges by 1. Depending on the fight, this can be a relatively big deal, or it can be completely meaningless, right? If we're playing against something that has an extremely long 6, 7, or 8 turn rage counter, that's meaningless, right? Even if we advance it by 1, the fight's not even going to last long enough for that rage counter to matter. So we can play this card freely. If we're fighting something where there are no rage counters, right, like the Hydrozoan Hivemind, for example, this is completely meaningless because for the majority of the fight, increasing the rage counter is not going to do anything at all to the fight. There's some rage counters that have abilities that do not matter much or at all for us. Those fights, this is meaningless. So it can be scary, and for the fact that there are some fights where this matters, cannot put it in the S tier, but outside of those niche scenarios, this is extremely overstated for cost, and for that purpose I feel very comfortable placing this in the A tier. Bound Fury, 4 mana 7/7. On play it gets -5/-5 for the round. Unfortunately, the biggest problem with this card is that when it gets -5 to its health and goes down to 2, it doesn't get that health back after the turn's over, right? Its max health goes back up to 7, but it stays at 2. So you're paying 4 mana for a 7/2, basically, and that's not really worth it. Generally, in the 4 mana slot for Ravagers, you want something that's going to not be vulnerable to the exact same things that your 0/1/2s and 3s are vulnerable to. You want something that can tank a chunky hit, or something that converts into value in terms of multiple bodies on board, something that draws you cards, something that finishes the game, and this doesn't do any of those things, and for those reasons I'm placing it in the C tier. Caltrops, I'm going to go ahead and evaluate all of the direct damage spells that Ravager has access to right away together. So we have Caltrops, which is doing 10% of the maximum life of the enemy for 1. We have Eruptor Shot, which is dealing 20% of the maximum life of the enemy for 5. So we're getting double the effect for pentuple the cost. We have Ferrous Firebomb, which is inflicting wildfire on an ability. This is going to be for 2 mana, and as a reminder, the wildfire will be dealing 2 or 3 damage randomly each turn, and it does also have a chance to spread. Now, I don't have any experience seeing this spread. I'm not sure what the chance is, but I don't think it's reasonable to evaluate the card with that in mind necessarily. But this does represent somewhere in the neighborhood of 10, possibly 15 damage over the course of an average fight. And then lastly, we have Wave of Lava, which we saw earlier, and this is going to be 7 mana. It's going to deal 10 flat, and it's going to inflict all enemy abilities with wildfire, right? So that's going to translate to somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 or something in that neighborhood damage every single turn from this point onward. So obviously, amongst this group of cards, the big standouts are going to be Wave of Lava, because this serves almost as a 1-card finisher for every fight, right? The amount of damage this can output is adequate that the entire rest of the deck could be focused on something else other than doing damage. And then the other standout is going to be the Ferrous Firebomb, which I believe represents the most amount of damage in the most amount of situations, without being extremely inconvenient to play, like some of these others besides Caltrops can be. So, in terms of rating, I think for the average Ravager strategy, I believe this is the best one, Ferrous Firebomb. I will be putting this one in A tier. I believe the next best one is going to be Wave of Lava. Ravager can't really support this playstyle by itself, but it is undeniably a very strong playstyle if it is supported. So I consider this to be the next best option. I'm going to be placing this in the B tier. I have Caltrops is the next best one. It is quite cheap, and it is an acceptable amount of damage, particularly in the late game. And even on the final boss, which can be inconvenient to chip with cheap minions because of the board space limitation that Nest will impose upon you, this is able to convert 1 mana into a decent amount of damage. So it is valuable for that. I'll put it in B tier. And then last we have the... where has it gone? Eruptor Shot. I consider this to be the worst one. You're spending a lot of mana, and you're not getting a lot of value out of it. Right, your turn 5 slot, this is something that needs to be winning you the game, or it needs to be something that pivots you into the ability to retake the board after the opponent has presumably wiped your board or has imposed some strict condition upon you. So Eruptor Shot just doesn't fit the bill for that for the 5 mana slot. If it costs 3 mana, I'd reconsider for dealing this amount of damage, but at 5 I certainly don't think this is a very useful card for Ravager to have. So I'm putting this in C tier. Alright, scrolling back up, we have Cannon Fodder. This one has good stats for the cost, right? You're paying 1, you're getting a 2/1 charger. That's valuable because you're getting an extra attack out of something. And in combats where your fights are only lasting 4, 5, 6 turns, getting an extra attack out of your cards is very meaningful. You get a lot more value out of them, especially considering this one is getting that +1 attack on the turn that you do this. That burst damage can be very meaningful, especially in a fight like the Sickly Serpent Skin, I believe it's called, the Wolf. You get an extra hit in quickly, which can matter for saving you 3 turns from the fight. This can matter in the Jellyfish fight, the Hydrozoan Hive Mind, where you can potentially get rid of an additional jellyfish and save yourself a lot of grief. And also it's just a decent amount of damage, and then you can just dominate the body away after you've gotten your value out of that 3/1 charge. So this fits our strategy perfectly. I'm putting this in the A tier. Cathedral Conservator. This is exactly the kind of thing we're wanting to see in our mid-game plays in our 3 mana slot, right? It is contributing to a wide board presence by summoning a Crumbling Gargoyle, which we'll be looking at later, every single turn. So that's excellent. It's also a good body itself to be dominated away when you're ready to make a push to end the game. And you have an interesting degree of choice there, right? You can either play your Dominates a turn early, lose this, and lose out on potentially another Crumbling Gargoyle, or you can wait, get another Crumbling Gargoyle, cash in on the next turn, and that's something that you're going to be able to dynamically choose between on every new combat based on the situation. So that's very interesting. This card's superb. The only weakness here is that you have limited access to frontline, and that means that it can be difficult to keep this thing on the board for a really long time, to get 3 or 4 Crumbling Gargoyles out of it. This is mitigated by options which do provide frontline. It's mitigated by options which can buff this card. Generally those will come from relics, or from the gifts, I believe they're called. And then also you could just accept the fact that he's going to make 2 or so gargoyles and die. That's also perfectly fine. Well worth your 3 mana that you've spent. So this card, I firmly believe, is going to be our next S tier candidate. So that's where he goes. Next is the Crumbling Gargoyle. Even at the 2 mana that this is increased in cost to be as the reward from your patron, the card is still good. The 2 mana 5/1 with the end of turn effect, still strong. And so at 1 mana, even better. Getting a 5/1 for that price point is extremely good. And then, you know, it's going to discount down to a 4/1, of course, before it attacks for the first time. So basically, it's attacking once for 4, once for 3, maybe again for 2, but it may or may not be dominated away by that time. But for that price point of 1 mana for 7 damage that you're generally going to be seeing out of this card, that's really valuable. And that is the kind of output we're expecting from something like Caltrops, right? Except this is actually a body on the board you can do other stuff with, like buff it or sacrifice it to dominate, right? Caltrops, this is only outperforming that hit with a 4, hit with a 3 from Crumbling Gargoyle if the enemy has 71 or more HP, which most enemies do not have. So this just further goes into my thought process regarding the burn cards, why I like these a lot better. I do believe Crumbling Gargoyle belongs in the A tier. Next card we have Death March. Right, now this card has changed. The draw card at the beginning is new. It didn't used to do this. Nonetheless, though, I'm still not a huge fan of this card for a couple of reasons, right? One, dying at the end of your next turn, while that's not as huge of a deal as it sounds like on paper, because it is moderately doable to map out what your present and next turn will look like. You know what the opponent's going to do usually, and you know what you're going to be doing usually as well, except for the 2 new cards that you're going to be seeing. One from this card, one from your draw for turn next turn. So it's not as crippling as it sounds to die at the end of your next turn, but it's still limiting as to when you're able to play this card. So if I'm drawing this on turn 1, it's a dead card in my hand. I can't do anything with it on turn 1. I can't do anything with it on turn 2. I may or may not even be able to use it on turn 3. Maybe I can use it to close the game out a turn early on turn 4, maybe not. So that's one problem with this card, it's just dead. Whereas if I was playing something like a Cathedral Conservator or a Crumbling Gargoyle, not dead, I can reliably play these as soon as I can afford them every single time without any trouble. This card, not so. The other problem is, this is antithetical to the gameplay that we want to be achieving with the Ravager faction, right? This is encouraging me as a player to sit back, hold back some of my cards so that I can get more mana for this to be valuable to me. And I don't want to do that. I want to be playing my cards on the board immediately as soon as I can afford them, right? If I have cards like, you know, Cannon Fodder, I want to play that immediately to swing for that 3, and then if it survives the turn, I get another 2, and I've almost doubled the value of my card just by playing it on curve. If I'm sitting on it, I'm exchanging that double, triple value from multiple attacks for 1 mana on Death March, which I might not even be able to leverage meaningfully, right? If I have something like a Lone Ladybug, if I've gone with Sylvans, I'm not going to sit on this so that I can go +1 mana for my Death March play. I'm just going to play it, and I'm going to have that 1/2 body soaking up attacks, keeping my board wide, and setting up my future plays. So for this reason, I don't think Death March is worth considering, and I'm going to be placing it in the C tier. Eruptor Shot we have covered already, so now I'm going to move on to the Fear Guard Initiate. The Fearless keyword is going to be buffing his attack by an additional 10% of the opponent's max life. Again, this reflects unfavorably on cards like Caltrops Interrupter Shot, because every time this is attacking, in addition to the 1 damage he's going to be doing already, he's also doing another 10% each time he swings in. And on top of it, he has the 4 health body, which is very meaningful, because a lot of attacks in this game will be doing 1, 2, or 3 health. And then the ones that are really scary for Ravagers, the most damaging ones in the game for the Ravager faction, are the ones that are going to be doing 5 damage, and they're going to be bleeding that over onto your hero if there's any left over. 4 is not going to block all of it, but you're only taking 1, which is a lot more meaningful than if that was to hit something like a cannon fodder. A lot of your X1s, a lot of your X2s, you're going to be taking 4 or 3 damage every time one of those enemies uses those attacks, and Ravager does not have the tools to sustain through that amount of unavoidable life loss. So cards like this, which are both effective at executing the Ravager game plan and also at preventing that bleed-in damage, very useful. This card is absolutely superb, and I'm going to be placing it in the A tier. Next, we have the Fear Guard's Battle Trainer. This is everything that Fear Guard Initiate was and more, right? So we're paying 3 mana, we're getting the 3/2, and then we're trading one of the minions we have on board for a copy of Fear Guard Initiate, right? So in keeping with our game plan of going wide early turns and then converting mid-game into a taller or game-finishing strategy, this does exactly that, right? I'm trading something weak, my Vent Shambler, I'm trading my cannon fodder, just something like that, for an enormous Fear Guard Initiate, right? This is going to be like a 5/4, 6/4, 7/4, and I'm getting that on top of this 3/2 body here, which in itself is going to be giving me +1 bodies on the board to contribute to further dominate plays. So this card, one of the best cards in the faction, no doubt about it. This is scoring in the S tier. Ferrous Firebomb we've covered, so we'll move on to From the Ashes. This is going to be dominating 1 in order to summon 2 Beast Tormentors. Now, very similar to Fear Guard's Battle Trainer. A lot of the same things that I said for that apply to this as well. There is a small disparity here, right? Like Beast Tormentors are going to be a lot more valuable with their flat damage early game, whereas the Fear Guard's Battle Trainer is going to be more valuable for tankier enemies, right? And the exact turning point, we could say this is providing me with 2 bodies of 4/3, so 8 damage, right? Whereas the Fear Guard's Battle Trainer, that's going to be giving me 2 bodies with 3 + 1, so 4. And so that means that the enemy needs to have 5, or excuse me, it needs to, this needs to give me 5 more damage in order to be dealing the 9 that would be worth more. So basically, if an enemy has 50 HP or more, I'm sorry, I'm working this out on the fly, but yeah, if an enemy has 50 HP or more, and this is attacking for 1 + 5 = 6, + 3 = 9, that means that you've gone profitable in damage over the Beast Tormentors. So they're very similar cards in terms of their output in your average game. Not a lot of enemies are going to have too much more than that 50. Like, I believe the final boss is either 70, possibly 80 off the top of my head. So functionally, these are quite similar, and I feel very happy putting From the Ashes in the S tier as well. Impling, excellent card, short, sweet, to the point, 1 mana 3/2, overstated, undercosted, no fancy ability, just generic. Play the card, get a good board presence early, swing in for 3, 6, possibly 9 damage, sacrifice it for a dominate, win the game. Very good card. I'm going to be putting this into the A tier. Infernal Reincarnation. Now this card is peculiar, right? So what we have going on here, it's going to be dealing 2 damage to all of your board. Anything that would have died that way is instead fully healed and given +2 attack. It's a little awkward to evaluate, but it does fit our gameplay pattern that we're looking for, right? Where we're trying to build up a board and then mid-game pivot into an Alpha Strike, and this can contribute meaningfully to that, and we do have a lot of options for those early game plays that do fit the bill for dying, in quotation marks, to this 2 damage, right? Impling, the Vent Crab, Battle Trainer, Gargoyles, Conservator, Cannon Fodders. We do have a lot of options in that slot, more that we'll see below, and more from other factions as well. And for each and every one of those, you're going to be seeing 2 additional damage. every turn from those. So it is valuable. It can be a little awkward to line this up in a way that is extremely maximally contributing to a strong strategy here, right? Like, it's not like you're going to go out of your way to have all your creatures at 2 health exactly unless all your stars have aligned. But all things considered, it does do the kind of thing that we want our decks to do, and for that purpose I do feel comfortable putting this in the A tier. Next up is Insect Collector. This is going to be a 2 mana 1/1 that summons the 0 mana 1/2 Ladybug from the Sylvan faction for us on play. So this is nothing flashy. This is like a much lower impact but also a cheaper effect than we're seeing on something like the Battle Trainer or on the From the Ashes. Now, of note, this is giving us +2 bodies instead of the +1 we're getting from these because it isn't sacrificing anything to play itself. And it is cheaper. So it does curve into our plays, like playing a Baphomet early or getting value out of a gift, which will be buffing our attackers, or something that we're going to see later that is going to also be giving damage to our attackers. But it's also just a lot less flashy than those cards and a lot less impactful on the game state. Nonetheless, I feel comfortable putting this in the A tier. Next, we have the Iron Maiden. We discussed this briefly at the beginning of the video, but again, it's going to have a large amount of health, and specifically 5 health is meaningful because those are going to be the quantities we're going to see on those painful those painful trampling damage effects, right? They're going to be dealing 5 and then dealing bonus damage to your portrait based off of whatever bled through. This is going to block all of that. That's meaningful. Anything less than that, it's going to be blocking those hits as well, and then swinging back for 2 damage when it does so. You can get really cute with this, like with Infernal Reincarnation. In theory, in practice, not going to happen, but that is something fun to keep in mind. So this is a valuable card for like a stall strat, for a mid-range strat where you just want to have stronger value on all of your cards and you're not going to really worry so much about having that commanding early game presence. This requires supplementation from other factions to be viable, and for that reason I would have to be putting this in the B tier. Next, we have Lady of the Pact. Not a big fan of this card, being honest, but evaluating it, what we're looking at, we're basically discarding a card from our hand in order to staple its stats onto a minion that will be costing 1 and have 1 additional health. So best case scenario we're looking at here, if I was building really tall and the only minions that I had in my deck are really chunky ones, right? Like, I guess the most prominent in archetype example that pops to mind is going to be the 4 mana 7/7, right? So if this is in my hand, it is cheap at 4 mana. And so I'll be discarding that and gaining 7/7, so I've played a 1 mana 8/8 for the cost of 2 cards in hand. So that's the Magic Christmas Land outcome. In practice, I'm not a fan of this because, again, Ravager can't really afford by itself to play that sort of a play style. I can't rely on drawing Lady of the Pact and a really chunky minion in my hand and pivot my entire early game around that play, right? It's something nice that can happen sometimes, but almost every other time you're just going to have a handful of low cost or mid cost creatures because that's what your whole strategy is, and this does not fit well into that strategy. You would prefer to have those cards, play all those cards individually instead of discarding one just to have a chunkier Lady of the Pact. For this reason, I put this in the C tier. Lava Moss Smith, very simple card. We're looking at a 3 mana 1/3, not great stats for cost, but it does give us the Overlord ability, which will be giving +1 attack to every attacker, as long as it's held back from battle, which is what that Overlord keyword is going to be meaning. So this represents, right, a couple of important things. One, I'm getting value out of this card on the turn that I played it. Effectively, this represents a similar amount of damage as something that has charge would, right? If I'm attacking with, let's say, 4 minions on turn 3, that's not uncommon. I'm getting a whole 3 or 4 damage out of this card the very turn that I play it, and then from then on, every other turn that I play it, I'm still getting that same amount of damage. The 3 health on him, also meaningful. There's a lot of 2 damage AoEs in the game. He doesn't die to those. There's some things that can hit your backline for 1 or 2 damage. He doesn't die to those either. So that's good. Good for him. He provides a valuable boon to the deck. He gets an A tier for his contribution. Next red, we got to scroll down a little bit to find him. It's going to be the Spindle Hatch. That's the 4 mana 2/6. I find this to be a more valuable card than the Iron Maiden. I consider the 2/6 body to be better, and I consider summoning an Impling better than getting 2 damage in when I survive damage. So he is better than the Iron Maiden in my opinion, but still, I don't think this is the kind of playstyle that is supported in Ravager by itself, right? Like, Ravager should be winning the game or making game-winning plays with 4 mana, and this isn't that. This is very effective for like a mid-range strategy, right? If like, imagining if this was the first minion that I played, I've been gaining borrowed life turns 1, 2, and 3, then this is my first big thing on the board. He's going to be eating a lot of hits and summoning a lot of Implings before he's taken down. So you get a lot of power out of this in that situation. But that's not the situation that the usual unsupported Ravager has access to, and for that reason I'm putting this in the B tier. Next card is Step Forward. We get access to 1 mana for 1/1 of stats. That's good. We also get Frontline on the target creature, which is also potentially good, right? We can do some pretty cool outplays with this. We can keep our board wide for longer by surviving hits with the 1/1 that we've put on whatever creature we're frontlining. But the other problem is this card has prerequisites. That's being having targets on the board and having targets worth frontlining on the board, right? Because otherwise, if we're paying 1 for a 1/1 on a creature that we already have, that's very unfavorable in comparison to like dominating that creature and getting this on your board, or dominating that creature and getting this on your board. Obviously the mana costs are disparate here, so it's not a one-to-one comparison, but pretty much what I'm trying to say is, if your 1 mana plays are not building your board, supporting future plays, they need to be really good to be worth it. And this one isn't quite there. Now, this is a solution to dealing with those really painful damage bleed through effects. And Ravager, you have to have a solution to that every game. You have to. You need to have a food in your deck that you can eat as soon as you take 10 damage, or you need to have some source of borrowed life, or you need some other source of healing, right? You need a gift that's going to give it to you, or a gift that's giving you borrowed life. You have to have those things, or you cannot consistently win your runs, because there will be fights where they will damage you, you can't do anything about it, and you'll die if you didn't have a solution. This is one of those solutions, so this is good for that, but I'm still going to be putting this in the B tier. Next up we have Swarm Them. Very simple, 4 mana, get 2 bodies on the board. Unfortunately, it is a bit expensive, but 4 mana for 6 damage worth of charging bodies, pretty useful. Were it 3 mana, I would probably be very happy stapling this in the A tier. 4 mana is a bit expensive, even though it is a really good effect. So I think I feel comfortable placing this in the B tier. But yes, bearing in mind, it does synergize a lot with a lot of the things we want to do. It just does them a little too late for my liking. Next we have Sword Runner. 3 mana 1/1. That body is terrible, as we know. In exchange, he has Frontline, which on a 1/1 is not attractive at all. But he does give 1 attack to all your creatures. Now, just the problem with this card, this is just worse Lava Moth Smith, right? Like, the body is awful, absolutely terrible. Like, the 1/1 is dying the turn after it's played, like almost every single time. And the exchange of getting 1 extra damage for all your creatures is nice, but like, Lava Moth Smith is just better in almost every scenario. There's very little value to having this aura of +1 attack, right? It makes things like Ram worse for the player. In exchange for buffing, like, I don't know, Iron Maiden, I guess you'll do a little extra damage, but it's just not worth it. It's not a great card. B tier for this. The Leviathan, this is something you ideally want to have in your deck every single run, and I believe it's worth spending every single beetle you have hard rerolling to find a copy of this card. This is probably the big reason why Ravager as a primary strategy is effective in the first place, right? Leviathan and Baphomet. And if you don't find either of those before the end of your run, you're probably going to have a hard time closing things out unsupported. But anyway, this is going to be providing us with that 8/5 body for 5 mana, which is going to gain a considerable amount of attack based off of how many creatures you summon, and it's going to have that rally keyword in exchange for dominating 4. So this is going to be the epitome of our strategy, right? This epitomizes the whole plan of going wide in the early turns and then using that wide board as currency to crush your opponent in the mid game. That's what this text box says. It just embodies that game plan by itself. S tier for sure. This is S plus tier. This is certainly the strongest of all the S tier cards. Candidate for one of the strongest cards in the game, really. So yeah, strongly S tier. Next we have Vein Drainer. It's a 0 mana 1/2, and on play you're going to gain attack based off of the number of other creatures that you have for the cost of 1 life. It pains me to say it, I have this card in C tier, and the reason for this is that Ravager cannot be paying 1 life for combat. That's too expensive for Ravager, a faction where there's just no way to sustain that life loss every single fight. And Lord knows you don't want to have this card in your deck when you don't intend to play it. That's C tier card material right there. So if you're drafting this card, you are intending to play it when you draw it, but you can't sustain the cost of doing so unless you've paired with empiricists to sustain that life loss or protect further life loss on top of it. So as nice as the effect is, right, as nice as a 0 mana 2/2 3/2 4/2 on turn 0, 1 or 2, or turn 1 or 2, that's attractive, but the cost is just too high for this, so I can't recommend playing this card, and I have it in C tier. Wave of Lava we have discussed, and then lastly we have Wildfire Drake. We have the 5 mana 6/5 fair mid-range body. His effect is to give an enemy ability Wildfire. So again, chunky body, 5 health matters. That's going to prevent the bleed over from the effects that do that. 6 damage is nice. It is a bit slow. Doesn't really synergize with what we want to be doing with our typical strategy at all. But if you were playing that mid-range strategy, this does fill that out nicely. So you have pretty good options. You have Spindle Hatch, you have the Wildfire, and you have the Iron Maiden. And I'm sure there's others in here as well that I've neglected to mention. So you do have good options for that playstyle. I just don't think that's the best way to play Ravager. And for that reason, I'm going to be placing this card in the B tier. That concludes my Ravager tier list for Acolyte of the Altar. If you have any questions or comments, if you disagree with any of my placements, please let me know in the comments. Hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.